Thank you, Professor Moran. Our next guest is a student and academic staff member, Indigenous academic staff member at UNE. Her name is Lynette Marlow. She is a Ngarabul and Dharug woman and a current candidate for the Doctor of Philosophy here at UNE. And her research is focused on Ngarabul placemaking. She's also part of a team working on an upcoming film about the resistance of the Dharug people, led by the Bidjigal warrior Pemulwuy, and the film is entitled Pemulwuy the Movie. In 2020, Lynette was part of a team that protested against the New South Wales Mole River Dam proposal, which was eventually abandoned in June 2022. Lynette has extensive experience in both local and federal government, having served as the Senior Policy Officer for the First Nations Treaty Campaign at the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Commission. Ladies and gentlemen, Lynette Marlow.
Good morning. I might as well sit down now. You've basically given my speech. Thank you, Uncle Colin, for your warm welcome. I acknowledge that we are on Anaiwan country today, and I pay my respects to the elders past, present and future. I thank you for your invitation for me to speak today. And I'm very honoured today to speak with Uncle Greg Strong and Vice-Chancellor Professor Moran. I also would like to acknowledge my Sydney-based elder, Bidjigal elder, Uncle Colin Isaacs, and for all those people who contributed with this speech. So let me introduce myself. Gurakumwanandaga. My name is Lynette Marlow. My people are Ngarabul from the Severn River, the Kubanunda, which is the northern New England tablelands. I also identify as Dharug from Sydney, and I'm a PhD student candidate studying Ngarabul placemaking. Today I'll be speaking about resilience post-referendum, keeping our fire burning and remaining black, loud and proud. And just a warning, I'll be discussing ancestors who have passed on. So the Dharug were the first people to endure invasion by the European settlers. And Uncle Colin Isaacs suggests that since colonisation, First Nation people have been oppressed by British laws and customs with little acknowledgement of our own. A Dharug story of early settlement is about our first warrior, Pemulwuy, who led the resistance against the invaders. Our dilemma was that the European settlers had broken our visitation laws and entered our country without agreement. Our Dharug laws had strict protocols for entering our country. Entering our country, our guides would give the travellers the rules where we would camp, hunt and gather, and the tracks that they could use. And while travelling, the visitors would be given a gum leaf branch, something like a passport. To our despair, during fierce Dharug resistance against the British, Pemulwuy was murdered in 1802. He was a martyr for our people. And since then, our motto has been to never give up. Today, our people continue to be resilient, standing black, loud and proud, proclaiming our citizenship to our First Nation countries through identifying with Anaiwan, Dharug, Ngarabul, to name a few. Fast forward, our resistance continued in 1972 with the Aboriginal Tent Embassy protest on the lawns of Old Parliament House in Canberra. A fire was lit, and this fire means passion to some, but personally for me, this fire symbolises our First Nations democracy, where we would sit around the fire and yarn, we would engage in deep listening, and we would resolve our differences. The fire at the embassy has continued for over 50 years, despite several early attempts by the Australian government to dismantle it. Another example of our resistance was the infamous 1992 Mabo versus the State of Queensland court case. It's important to note that Eddie Mabo and co initially lost their first case, but they stood their ground and eventually won in Mabo 2. The case acknowledged First Nations land rights. The Australian government's response to the Mabo case was the infamous Redfern speech by the former Prime Minister Paul Keating and the Commonwealth Native Title Act. Following Mabo in the 90s, it was an exciting time for First Nations people. In the late 90s, I was employed with the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Commission, ATSIC, in the National Policy Office Treaty Unit. We implemented the Treaty Let's Get It Right marketing campaign and the National Treaty Information and Awareness Strategy to educate First Nations people on the benefits of a treaty between Australia with the Australian governments. One of my ATSIC mentors was Gomeroi elder, statesman and delegate for this region, Uncle Lyle Munro Sr. Uncle Lyle shared invaluable wisdom and knowledge with me about resilience and his involvement with our First Nations, with our first Indigenous nationally elected committees, the National Aboriginal Consultative Committee and the National Aboriginal Conference, which he led in the 1970s and 80s. At that time, former Prime Minister, the late Malcolm Fraser, met with Uncle Lyle, and that was the beginning of the early treaty or Makarrata discussions. Uncle Lyle promoted truth-telling, reconciliation, and a treaty between our First Nations and non-Indigenous people as a way for our country to heal. Furthermore, in another example of our resilience in the late 1990s, Uncle Lyle and Uncle Colin Isaacs and many of our other elders in this region founded the Mile Creek Massacre Memorial Commemoration, a prominent place for truth-telling and reconciliation in Australia. They are supported by the Friends of Mile Creek, a non-Indigenous organisation. And we should take our elders' leadership as an example of where to go post-referendum as we aim towards reconciliation while still being loud, black, loud and proud. In the early 2000s, the Council for Aboriginal Reconciliation's final report called for the government to recognise that the land and its waters were settled as colonies without consent of its First Nations people. And as a sign of goodwill, 250,000 Australians walked across the Sydney Harbour Bridge in support of CAR's recommendations. It was the largest demonstration in Australia's history, an achievement our nation should be immensely proud of. However, in 2002, to our dismay, the Howard government began dismantling ATSIC. And in an act of resilience, Aboriginal-led organisations and the Australians for Native Title and Reconciliation continued with a national treaty conference, which was supported by Greek bodies such as the Australian Council of Churches and the Australian Medical Association. The late former Prime Ministers Hawke and Fraser agreed to speak at this conference, and our keynote speaker was the late David Irvine, the Northern Ireland Progressive Unionist Party leader. Irvine was one of the negotiators for the 1998 Northern Ireland Good Friday Agreement, and he urged Australians to move from the politics of division to the politics of peace with our First Nations people. He suggested that the politics of peace was difficult, but it was worth it. After ADSIC, there were positive steps towards reconciliation and First Nations rights and justice. For example, the Queensland-based Foundation for Aboriginal and Islander Research Action's chairperson, Les Mauser, was elected as the United Nations International Coordinator for Indigenous Peoples. He addressed the United Nations General Assembly in September 2007, where the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples was formally adopted. The UNDRIP asserts Indigenous peoples' self-determination, cultural rights over land, waters, and much more. In 2008, there was also the national apology to the stolen generations by the former Rudd government. This was a highlight. Sitting on the lawns of Old Parliament House with thousands of stolen generation people and their descendants, we never thought that that day would come, but it did. And last year, in October, post-referendum, my colleagues asked, where do we go now? I understand post-referendum why many Australians are concerned about the way forward in reconciliation. So let us collect our thoughts and move on with greater insight and determination as we have in the past. Keep sitting around our yarning circle. Let's keep our fire burning, truth-telling, embrace the politics of peace and reconciliation, and let us walk towards national emancipation through treaty. Because First Nation folks will never give up. We will always be loud, black, loud and proud. Let's keep that fire burning.